Hello, everyone, and welcome to another sort of pagan nerdery conversation between myself and the lovely Theo. We are just sort of this has kind of been a week on since our first sort of conversation, and today we're going to be talking about working in community and what that means within our respective traditions. So it's all very exciting. It seems to be quite a big part of both of our sort of practice. Like both of us seem to be kind of doing, we seem to do quite a lot of community stuff. I think I'm right in saying, like, obviously, you are involved in, is it 4 different witchcraft traditions, or is that?
Well, I was for like 4 to 5 years. I was involved in 4 different traditions, and I recently actually withdrew from 2. And that was my own kind of personal journey. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm mainly involved with the Order of Bards, Obecs, and Druids, but until quite recently, I was also quite heavily involved with the Warriors Corps, which is sort of a group, sort of an activist collective that kind of emerged in response to the threat posed by hydraulic fracturing to wells, rivers, sacred sites, and other parts of the landscape in the UK. And I was quite active in that for a while. But unfortunately, writing up one's thesis tends to take a toll, take its toll on such things. So I've had to kind of take a step back myself. What I was thinking is that we could maybe sort of talk a little bit about, firstly, what community as a sort of a concept means in our respective traditions and the traditions that we're involved in, and sort of where that understanding of community comes from within that tradition, and then we could perhaps talk a little bit more about our own personal experiences, and how maybe think a little bit about the way in which the community might evolve in the future. The communities we're involved with. Specifically because, there are 2 reasons why I find community particularly interesting myself. The first is that, as a social anthropologist, studying human social groups is a central part of what we do. And in particular, in my field site at the moment, one of the things that really came across quite strongly is that British society is quite fragmented. It's very individuated. You've got lots of little groups that are sort of constantly in a kind of almost kind of rubbing up against each other. There's a lot of tension over collective resources and different understandings about how things should be managed. And the ultimate manifestation of that is the Brexit vote, where the country basically split in 2 over one issue, and both sides think that the other side is nuts for thinking what they think. So that kind of polarization and that kind of lack of a kind of common understanding of how things work has really kind of put, for many people, not just myself and not just other social anthropologists, but many people in British society, this idea of community really at the centre of recent conversations that we've been having. So there's that. But also within Druidry, I'm very interested in community because at the moment, I've been actually writing a small amount of some articles on Gods and Radicals about the way in which the British pagan community and various initiatory traditions in British paganism actually kind of work in terms of power and in terms of money. Because whereas a lot of the anthropology of and the social scientific study of pagan religions has focused on belief and magic and ritual, all of which are very important. One thing that you don't see very much is an interest in what is political questions. Where does money come from? How a resource out of a group, and how kind of political choices and decisions are made, and how power is kind of sort of allotted out within the community. So that's kind of, so I've been trying to explore that a little bit and trying to use that as an opportunity to reflect on the future of British paganisms and British initiatory traditions. So that's why I'm quite interested in it at the moment.
Awesome. That's quite a lot.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm just like, okay, bomb. So before I say anything, one of the things I'm noticing is that you're like in like a summer shirt and I'm in this like beautiful winter jumper. And I just think that's really adorable, right? Like, you know, we're opposite sides of the world and we're well dressed for it.
Indeed.
Yeah, and it's the full moon in Scorpio. Yay, yay, yay. So I guess that, yeah, so the two traditions that I'm active in are wildwood and reclaiming, and and they are both I would say that reclaiming is definitely community oriented. Like some people even say that the capstone, like if reclaiming was like a what I lost the word, not a menhir, but you know those the stone structures that have the capstone, like Menentol has one. Sorry?
Dolmen.
A dolmen.
Dolmen.
Thank you. I lost the word. So some people have described reclaiming as like a dolmen, right? With the four kind of foundational pillar stones and then a capstone. And some of my elders have said that the capstone is community. So if the four pillars are, as they are often articulated to be, Anderson fairy witchcraft or ecstatic witchcraft is one of them. The psychology and human potential movement is another. Ecofeminism is another, and then anarchistic politics is the fourth. Then the capstone is community, and reclaiming is certainly a community-oriented tradition. I mean, all the core classes are open source material. Anyone can access them. Rarely would someone be turned away for lack of funds. Although a small fee or a manageable fee, often sliding scale, is charged, so that and that is actually a feminist ethic, so that the work of women is honored and paid for. Also, the way we teach in reclaiming is a little different culturally to the way other craft teachers teach. Because again, it's a community tradition, so it's an open source tradition, and there is an initiation in it. There is a lineage. There is a passing of power, and that is private, and that costs no money. And so that exists at the same time, but it's an own unique animal in the witchcraft kind of nexus, because to be a reclaiming witch, it is not required that you are initiated in the tradition. Like you can teach, you can priestess, which is our word for the act of doing, the verb of enacting the service of community in whichever way that happens for you, human, other than human, everything in between on either side. And so, you know, that reclaiming is its own enigma for that reason. Whereas wildwood, my primary tradition, is an initiatory tradition. While you might be a wildwood witch, in a sense, before you are initiated, it is made official at the initiation. Someone cannot call themselves a wildwood initiate without going through the initiation, of course. But also one cannot say I am a witch of the wildwood tradition without being initiated or dedicated. Whereas we do experience and therefore believe or are of the opinion that most of the people that we end up teaching were wildwood witches all along, and do have that intimate relationship with the place we know as the wildwood or the witches' forest. And both traditions are community oriented in various aspects. I mean, you know, for me, community is shared unity. Common, kind of like, I think of the commons. I think of the commons, and I think of the closing of the commons as a huge, especially in like the Western Northern European kind of egregore or collective consciousness, and empirically by empire, that has affected where I am and who I am, and most people in North America too, and many people in Africa and all sorts of other places. But what happened there, deeply wounded and scarred, and kind of smashed the nail through the coffin in some ways, in regards to how many people perceive and experience community. And certainly this has great effect on the history of witchcraft, and on the cultural ideas of what a witch is. Like the closing of the commons actually does influence that. So I think witchcraft, a lot of anthropologists define witchcraft by a being who is antisocial, or a being who is a sorceress or supernatural being who is selfish and only works for self. I actually have a problem with that definition. I mean, certainly there are many folkloric verifications or contexts to a definition close to that. But again, all those definitions are being conjured and created and curated by academics who are divorced and from the embeddedness of an animistic way of being, of a sensuous understanding of being an animal. There are some animals that are predators, but they are part of the cycle. And so while witchcraft might be, while witchcraft traditions or witchcraft practices might have more in common with predation or predatory animalistic experience, it is embedded in relationship with everything else that contextualizes that predation or predatory experience. Like one of my craft teachers often said to me and to others, the fetch beast, which is kind of an atavistic experience of one's own blood river, one's own ancestral inheritance, like the fetch, the sticky one, the primal soul, the animal. The fetch beast is whatever form that takes, or whichever skin you have to move in the other worlds with. Like I have several fetch beasts, and it's hard to find a fetch beast that isn't a predator in some way. But then to even kind of consider like the anthropomorphized human like description of what a predator is also like, that is also laden with crap. So like all of this is to say that community, like I'm kind of steering far away from human to human community. And like everyone is familiar with that kind of trope of the witch war, which is both like insulting and hilarious. Insulting because if it was a genuine witch war, there would be dead people. like if a witch war was happening, witches would be cursing other witches and people would be dead. So or at least their wealth would be drained, their houses would have fallen apart, and they would have had suffered some terrible consequences. Like the idea of internet witch wars or forum witch wars is kind of hilarious, but it's also a bane for online occult communities.
Absolutely.
And it's a bane for online pagan communities. Pagans and occultists are some of the most opinionated, self-righteous people on the planet, myself included. So it's like because we care so much, in a way, many of us care so much about our traditions, our histories, our place in the world. Some of us care about recognition beside kind of mainstream faiths. Others of us do not care about that at all, or sometimes care in the right context, and in other contexts don't give a shit at all. I kind of fit into that category. I've done interfaith training. I've spoken at the Parliament of the World's Religions as a pagan and a witch. I have, I've facilitated hundreds and hundreds of public rituals that cost nothing. I have tended covens. I have initiated covens. I have dissolved covens. I've initiated people, and all of this is about community. I mean, as a community of witches in the Wildwood, I care deeply about tending the initiatory lineages and the initiatory cultures and laws that I pass on as an initiator. I care deeply about it. I care deeply about the nourishing and the depth of our lore. I care deeply about helping people to facilitate contact with our spirits. I care deeply about cultures that arise out of what it means to be a witch today, out of the principles of transgression, out of the principles of being an enemy to the empire, out of the principles of sensuous, embedded, animistic, numinous awakening. This is the craft to me as I practice it. Sure, it can be maleficent to other humans, But oh well. That is part of community engagement. That is part of drawing a line and saying, you done fucked up, bitch, and I am here as a fate to decree that to be so. You know. So community is when you kind of intersect the concept of community with witches, it's, you know, and I'm not just talking, like, obviously I'm speaking about myself as like a folklorically inspired traditional witch. Like if a Wiccan answered that question, I don't know, it could be different. Or if a neo-Wiccan or if a neo-pagan Wiccan-inspired practicing magical witch, I don't know. It would be probably a little different, like maybe a little bit, I don't know, more homey.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, more homey is kind of, I think it's interesting. I find it always so fascinating to talk about the relationships between different pagan traditions. Because, I mean, obviously, Wicca and Druidry have a kind of a shared kind of, you know, they come from a very similar moment. And Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols, the founder of Obod, were friends. So they kind of exchanged a lot of ideas, and there's been a tremendous amount of interchange between the two. So I think maybe that homeliness is kind of, because it's something that maybe Obod would also, if that is indeed something that is true of Wicca, then Obod certainly possesses that. Because one of the things that people will say, there's a tremendous amount in that, and it was so fascinating, so many things we could talk about. One of the things that I particularly like your point was about the fact that, you know, community is not just a human thing. It's not just a thing for human beings. And I always say that one of the most important things to remember about the word for a specific gathering of Druids is a grove. Like, Druids come together in a grove, and that necessarily entails the presence of other than human persons, namely trees, namely sort of spirits that live in the grove. And even if you've got like a group of Druids, because we're within the order, we have groves and seed groups, and the seed group is simply a grove that that doesn't have 2 Druid members. So that basically within the order there are 3 different grades, and each grade is a stage in this kind of threefold initiatory journey that you go through. And even is that some people, it's sometimes, I mean, I thought this before I joined, that, you know, people who were in the bardic grade were the bards, and the people who are in the ovate grade are the ovates, and the people who are in the druidic grade are the druids in a formal sense. But that's actually not the case, even though people will kind of informally refer to people in the ovate grade as ovates. In reality, it's possible to be an ovate in the bardic grade, in the ovate grade, and the druid grade. Because those 3 words, bard, druid, and ovate, refer to a particular professional role. So a druid is a legal expert, and a counsellor, and a ritualist, and a priest. Ovate is a healer, and a mystic, and sort of a wise person, and an observer of omens. And a bard is a historian, and a poet, and a musician, and an enchanter, you know, someone who can use song and spells to kind of weave mystery in the world. And each one of those groups has a collection of learning attached to them. And one can identify oneself as saying, oh, well, you know, I feel called to becoming a bard, or called to becoming an ovate, called to becoming a druid. And so that even if you're in, say, the druid grade, you know, the druid grade, which is where you learn the lessons that the druidic path, as opposed to, or the ovate path, or the bardic path, each one of the grades teaches the lesson that profession has to teach. And then you can specialize. You can say, okay, well, you know, I'm in the druid grade, but I feel like I'm more of an ovate. I'm more into the reading of omens than I am into priesting work or community work or whatever. You know, you might, you know, again in the ovate grade, but also say, you know, actually I feel called to be a bard. And there are many members of the order who, despite the fact that they are in the druid grade, will identify as being a bard or an ovate. So it's kind of that's an important qualification. So, but the idea is that but bards, ovate, people in the bardic grade, people in the ovate grade, people in the druid grade meet in smaller groups, which are seed groups, or they meet in these larger gatherings, which are the groves. And both of those require, like I say, require the presence of non-human persons. It requires a germinating seed, a little plant at the beginning, or a whole grove of trees. And I think that's incredibly important. And it's something that we so easily lose sight of in sort of Western societies today. So thinking about this question of sort of how community emerges. I mean, obviously there is this kind of structure where you have certain druidic orders, and then of course you have the Druid network, which was kind of set up to provide a space for people who didn't particularly resonate with the structure of a kind of a mystery school or an initiatory order, because there are druids who prefer not to sort of approach their kind of way. And within that, what's interesting is that a lot of what I found is that the Druid community in Britain is very inter-organisational. So you will get people who are members of OBOD, but are also doing the British Druid Order course, or you will get people who are members of the British Druid Order and are doing that course, but are going to the Druid Network's Druid Camp. So there's a lot of circulation between our groups, and I don't know the extent to which that's true of other kind of. I'm sure it must be for all different pagan initiatory traditions, but it's certainly particularly true of the Druid community. And you'll see kind of the same faces appearing at lots of different events and stuff. But I think the place where I experience, and so what that means is it kind of creates this feeling of almost like being in a little village. Like there's probably somewhere in the region, in the UK, just looking at Facebook groups, there's about 5,000 people in the Facebook groups of the Order of Bards Ovates, the OBOD Friends page, and the British Druid Order page. So if we kind of use BDO as a kind of an estimate maybe of how many British Druids there are, it's a little bit inaccurate. If we looked at the census data, we see a similar figure. 2011, there are about 4,000, I think it's 4,162 people who said identified themselves as Druids. And so if we go just that as kind of vague, as a rough figure, that gives, the idea that the number of Druids in the UK at any one time is a little bit like a small village, and we all kind of know each other, or we know of each other, and we all kind of meet up, and there will be, for different events, and there's almost this kind of feeling of like helping each other out, of like, you pop down to see someone who lives down in another part of the country, and it would just be you catch up on all the gossip over a cup of tea, and there's something very resonant of that kind of that local community feel within the order, even though everyone lives, often many miles apart. But where I find that all comes together is at camps. So when people go out and celebrate one of the seasonal festivals by camping out, sometimes for quite a long period. So either anything between a long weekend to a whole week. And when you're in those sorts of camping type environments, you really start to see people experimenting in that kind of local, quite intense community type experience. And that can be difficult as well as really lovely. So it can be wonderful to have these, it can really be an amazing way of deepening your relationship with people, and it's an incredible experience to have those sorts of to have that kind of emotional intimacy with a group of people. Very hard to establish in wider society quite often, but it can sometimes be difficult. There are always these kind of teething problems, and as you say, like arguments over points of principle, witch wars, that's just kind of part of what it means to actually live in a small community where everyone is in each other's pockets. And there's all sorts of great novels and stuff about, if you look at the Lark Rice Counterfeit series, if you listen to, there's this radio show in the UK called The Archers, and it's full of arguments and kind of people falling out and all sorts of, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not like a war. To call it that would be to kind of completely miss the point, because it's there's a sort of a quotidianness that war does not express, I think.
Totally.
So yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice when you see that happening. I mean, what do you think are the ingredients for kind of sort of, what do you feel that kind of are the ingredients for kind of creating a community that sort of is kind of a positive experience for people in a general sense. So, of course, there's this level of ambiguity. Like, there will be some good days and bad days, but how can you kind of ensure that it's worthwhile, even despite that?
Oh, I have lived my life as a community engaged, and by which I mean the communities of my traditions, although sometimes like greater pagan, greater occult, greater magical communities, for a long time, for 15 years or so, and sometimes it's hard because when you're relatively known in a small subculture at all, so I write books and I teach publicly and all of that. Of course, like, I'm going to be one of the people that is projected upon the most easily, and is the whole, we have this thing in Australia called the tall poppy syndrome. I'm not sure if you have that in the UK, but this if someone leads, if someone pops their head above the crowd to lead in any way, immediately they're going to be fucking destroyed. And I've totally experienced that, but I have a deep dedication to my gods, my spirits, the traditions that nourish me and that I have nourished. And I have a deep dedication to my capital W work. And I am open, like, in my traditions and in my communities, I have always been open to feedback. I engage feedback. I like to be really transparent and clear. Most people who've ever had conflict with me, or if I've had conflict, we've worked it out through mediation. So I guess in terms of like a healthy community, one needs to be able to engage one's own parts, like the practices of magic, the craft especially, are not for the feeble-minded, are not for people who want a lazy spirituality. The craft is, I don't know if it was Victor Anderson, but in Anderson Fairy, a tradition I studied in for 7 years up until recently, and I love the Anderson Fairy tradition. It deeply inspires me. It's just at this point I've sealed it for some time, my journey with that tradition. But I learned a great deal in 7 years of studying in that tradition. And Victor Anderson, or someone close to Victor, would often say this is a warrior tradition. And that is true of witchcraft in general. And I know I'm invoking this like warrior thing again when we just talked about witch wars and how we don't like witch wars, or it's not exactly the best term, it doesn't fit. But a warrior to me is a little different, because again, what context of warriorship or warriorhood are we evoking with that term? I think we're evoking something a little more noble. like the idea, I had a very powerful mystic and experience recently with one of the spirits of the wildwood, who is a wolf god. And they were telling me in possession, myself and a fellow initiate, we were by a river in Melbourne, the Maribyrnong River, which is a tidal river, and we were doing some spirit work, and I became mantled by the Wolf King and then possessed by the Wolf Mother. And I usually remember little to nothing of what goes on in that time. And so my friend relayed it to me, and there was this really intense message that came through, which was that the Wolf Mother, which is kind of like the oversoul genius ancestor of all wolves, as she relates to the Witch Queen, who is very other than human. The Wolf Mother apparently was telling us that before the 1788 invasion of the First Fleet, the 11 ships that came with Captain Arthur Phillip to this country, the Wolf Mother had come before them because she was alive in their memory of the wild forests of Europe, and she came before them to warn the various peoples of Australia, of what we now call Australia, the southern continent, right? That people were coming who were not noble warriors. People were coming to commit to something that her ancestors and her wolfkin would never agree to. Like, you know, wolves are predators, but it's not like wolves go and slaughter villages or commit genocide. So, so this, like, it was a real, I don't know really how to convey it more than that. It was this, like, you know, again, it brings us back to colonization, empire, all, you know, kind of rapaciousness, greed, capitalism, class system, warfare. Like the warrior is a different kind of beast, because, you know, like, so to use another example, there's a practice that I have, which exists in reclaiming Edison Fairy Wildwood, this triple soul alignment, right? We look at it in a few different ways, but basically we say we experience that we are a tripartite being, that I am comprised of the red river of my ancestors, which gifts me my fetch, that I am comprised of the star seed or demonic genius that is not of the red iron river of my ancestors, is something other. Sometimes we poetically refer to it as being starseed, or, you know, related to something greater than this planet. And then when those two, what is up and down, what is upper world and underworld, but ultimately what are kind of divine twins drawn to each other, find each other, they push into the world and draw in the breath that kind of winds them all together to create the circumference to the kind of pulsing center, the breath soul, the aura, the talker, the namer. And so those three parts are required in community as well. If we can say that's the microcosmic me, then those three things must be working in a witch community to have it healthy. There must be deep listening and perceptivity and intimacy with the sensuous animal, with the needs of the animal. If we are not getting our base holy needs met, if we are not beings who understand rest and food and water and land and light and shadow, if we are not beings who understand what it means to speak with inspiration, to seek out the counsel of wisdom, of more than just the complex of me, if we are not beings who then try to communicate to each other through story and ritual and art and custom and law, then we have no community, we have no common unity, we have no shared unity. We need all three. We need the greater than the sum of its parts kind of inspiration and depth, to be the profound principled center, you know, to be that campfire that you and I have talked about before, that we tend and chop the wood for, and, you know, and go out into the forest and ask for permission to take that wood, to give offering, to make exchange, to make it right, to consolidate in a firm right relationship, to then know the best and most efficient ways, the most economic ways to light that fire, the most economic ways to sustain that fire, when to share a common understanding of when we need the fire, to cook, to have those who are skilled at cooking, to find those ingredients, to hunt, to kill, to honor those spirits of plant and fungi and red one, you know, all of that. We need everyone in I feel like what is lost in the greater witchcraft renaissance is we squabble about what a witch is so much, and every tradition and every person in every tradition or non-tradition has some really, you know, zealous, passionate understanding. And I think it's, again, possibly, maybe it's just witches, or it could just be humans. But I feel like witches argue about it more than Christians do. Like, do you profess, you know, belief and faith, and complete kind of fidelity to Christ as your savior, as the truth, the way, and the life? You're a Christian, right? Well, are you a witch because you work magic? That can't be the qualifier, because ceremonial magicians, druids, what we kind of nefariously in a way call shamans, all, you know, are actors. All forms of people make magic consciously and conscientiously. It's not that, you know, yes, culturally we connect magic to witches, but that's not the qualifier. It cannot be, you know. So this is part of our community fracture as well, because while many of us do know what we're talking about and do know where that's coming from, as in we're describing our actual practice, our actual cultus, our actual engagement, there is still this like almost vicious kind of fracture. And what I would say to that is, take a fucking breath, like drop into your animal, drop into your fetch, kiss your god soul, fucking go up, go down, go all about, go in and out, and then say something later. There is a line in this kind of what is called the long version of the Wiccan Rede, but was actually attributed to Adriana Porter by Lady Gwen Thompson in the 1970s, who has her own network of traditionalist Celtic witches in New England. She, I'm a nerd, sorry. She has this line in this kind of poem of couplets, and it says, "Speak little, listen much." And it's beautiful. Like if anyone is watching this and they've never kind of looked up the Rede of the Wicca by Lady Gwen Thompson or Adriana Porter, her paternal grandmother, really look that up, because there are some interesting things in there, and I think they are wise. And so, speak little, listen much also matches a lot of the indigenous wisdom of the first peoples of this country, and they know a lot about community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, I feel like, this is, before I come in with some, I had another question that I really wanted to get your thoughts on. Is the witchcraft community composed of covens, right? So, like, if you imagine like an organism, and this is kind of shitty, slightly bad metaphor, but like, if they're like cells in an organ in some respects, or if they're like in the same way that the Christian community is composed of churches, each church is a parish, or is it more that there is this community of witches, or perhaps a community of which witches are part, and then witches gather together to produce covens at certain times for certain purposes? Like what is a coven for? Is it an exercise in the witch community, or is it something that a community, potentially the witch community, does for a certain purpose, for a certain period of time? Am I completely phrasing this wrong?
No, okay. I peripherally project that I understand what you're saying. No, look, in my opinion, because of the nature of witchcraft, okay, because there is still to this day a little bit of territorialness around that word. Who owns that word? Who can use that word? Certainly there are some very, very few, but there is still kind of a small kind of section of the Wiccan, the Gardnerian, Alexandrian collection of traditions who would be like, we're witches, we are witches, no one else is a witch. Witches, and that is a small minority. It's tiny. I have many Wiccan friends, but so there's that, and then there's the whole like kind of co-option of the traditional witchcraft movement by people who are not connected to covens or lineages or orders, but who are doing witchy shit, as in they're being inspired by historical forms of witchcraft, doing like deep research, academic research, primary, secondary sources, studying folklore, might even have a connection to teachers and have done apprenticeships with people but want to practice on their own, like many witches did in the past and still to this day do. Like it's almost like some people get so passionately tied to their form of witchcraft that they don't want to let it go and have anyone else have a passionate form of witchcraft. Certainly, look, for me, the way I understand it, because of the history of the revival of witchcraft, or the witchcraft renaissance, which is happening right now again, there is a different kind of witchcraft renaissance happening now than the revival than the creation of modern pagan witchcraft. I would say that the creation of modern pagan witchcraft that Ronald Hutton so delicately, fastidiously articulates in his book, The Triumph of the Moon. But like, again, the creation of this idea of pagan witchcraft, well, it's so, God, that is a whole other talk. Covens.
Yeah,
Covens. I'm trying to give context. I like to give as much context as possible, but there's just so little time. Covens. My answer, not the answer, my answer to your question is this. There is no such thing as a witchcraft community. There is no such thing. All there, all there is a lot of traditions. And a lot of people reading books, doing their own eclectic or syncretic, spirit-led, book-led thing on their own. And they might go to stores and pagan festivals and other things. Maybe later they'll join the coven. Not necessarily at all. But I dwell in the world where there are covens, and sometimes we do share camaraderie with witches of other traditions and other covens. Like I share camaraderie in my own Wildwood tradition with witches of other covens, but in my Wildwood tradition we have people who are called wanderers. We don't call them solitary because the poetics of that doesn't make sense. You cannot be a solitary witch in our cosmology. It makes no sense. We call them a wanderer. So those are the people who are non-group affiliated practitioners of our tradition. In reclaiming, however, there is a witchcraft community. And so again, reclaiming is such a different beast. It occupies, because we have witch camps where upwards, where depending on the size of the camp and the length of the camp, between 40 to 140 people gather for either 3 nights to 4 nights to 7 nights in different places throughout the world, mostly in Turtle Island, North America, and in Australia and Europe and Britain. Those are the places. Yeah, there are about 20 of them. And, we gather and we do form networks of political activists, of devotional witches, of ecstatic witches, of sorceress witches. We form enclaves and guilds. And, I would probably say that reclaiming is probably one of the largest witchcraft traditions. But not everyone who affiliates with reclaiming or attends reclaiming classes would even identify as a witch. And many of them would say they're animists or they're pagans. Although Starhawk did say, she's one of the progenitors of the tradition and one of the most well-known kind of liturgists and poets of the tradition. She did say that once. She did say to be a reclaiming witch, to be in reclaiming one might have to identify as being a witch, or one might have to identify as being a witchcraft tradition. But I get, Starhawk's poetry around that has changed, and I can't speak for her. Certainly she identifies as a witch and is an initiated witch. So, it's so, my answer is, covens. Covens before community. And what the fuck is a witch community? I don't even fucking know. Lately I've seen that marvelous, hilariously profane quote by Terry Pratchett he seems to have definitely known witches. That quote that kind of flies around every now and again and is flying around now again, which talks about, the natural, the traditional number of a witch, of a coven is 1. Do you know that quote that I'm talking about?
I do. Terry Pratchett, you're absolutely right. He knows so much about witches. It's kind of completely. But incidentally, there's another quote which I love, which is on that issue, which is there's Granny Weatherwax who's so he's got this wonderful quote which says, officially the witches had no leader, but but everybody knew that Granny Weatherwax was the leader the witches did not have. And that's also very, very true of how witchcraft seems to kind of, or at least in my experience of it seems to kind of be organized. There's a lot of soft power going on. There's, if someone were to kind of try and elevate themselves up above everyone else in a real, that you get tall poppy syndrome kicking in really strongly, I think. Particularly if someone would try to do that across traditions. Within traditions, it perhaps is slightly different, but across traditions, I think there is a real, but nonetheless, there are people that people would know. If you ask someone who's kind of got influence and who's kind of, in a position of respect and regard, they'd be like, oh, it's that person. So I absolutely love that kind of, because it's interesting, because I've been thinking about this a lot and talking about this a lot with other Druids recently, because I think actually within Druidry there are quite a lot of different quite a lot of different views about what the Druid community could be, or what people are trying to make out of it. So you get some people who I think would like the Druid community to be effectively like a tribe or a collection of like a tribal confederacy. So you've got a number of different little groups. All of those little groups know each other very well, and they're part of a broader tribal confederacy. You sometimes see that kind of language being used within OBOD. So and that kind of feeds into the sort of ethos that I mentioned at camps, and many of us who took part in the kind of White Horse, who take part or in White Horse camps, and as they are now, OBOD camps as they were, have expressed a feeling that we all kind of knew each other as a community in some kind of previous existence, so that we'd all perhaps in the Iron Age or the Neolithic, or at some point, or the Bronze Age, we all kind of were a community once before, and we all lived together and all knew each other and were all related to each other, and we've just sort of come home and we've come back to that in this lifetime in a different kind of format.
That is a common understanding, I think, and I'm wondering if Ross Nichols was inspired by Gardner, because in some forms of Wicca, or maybe all forms of Wicca, and certainly this holds true in the traditions I practice, there is this concept of to meet, to know, to remember, and love again. And there is this idea that one will find, like, I grew up, I mean, I'm nearly 30, but what I mean by I grew up in witchcraft with this understanding, this native, intrinsic, inherited understanding from nowhere in particular, that if you were a witch before, you will be a witch again. And in my experience, that is true, and in the experience of most witches I know, that is true. And we often say things like, and this has nothing to do with religion, like nothing. We often we often say, like, it's a cultural thing in our subculture, right? Like, or in our culture, or in our cultures. Like, if someone suddenly stops being a witch, we get really confused, and we're like, well, I guess, were they ever a witch? Because the idea that you could stop practicing what is yours to practice is really odd, because we're not talking about a religion that you adopt. We're talking about, so many people talk about coming home, which is a kind of a pagan phenomenon, but literally I remember reading books and discovering things about various witchcraft traditions as a young, like 12 and 13 and 14-year-old, and all of it I already knew. And this is like, I was like, oh yeah, I know that, yep, I knew that, like, yep, I remember that, like, and that is not just me, that is most people. Like, yep, that, yep, I know all of that. Like, it wasn't like I was adopting practices that were foreign to my experience. I was just like, well, that all makes sense. I remember that. Like, that's something that is true for us.
There's a tremendous amount of stuff like that about, just like little bits of ritual or words that I've used or beings that I've seen, and then find out that they're actually a character in a story or a myth or what have you. So I feel that that's a real kind of common thread, actually, linking all our traditions together. And I mean, one of the things so I think there is an element of that within OBOD, but I also feel that there's a kind of, I think a lot of people see Druidry and treat Druidry as kind of a way into, because as I mentioned, all of the different grades within the order are a form of a profession or a collection of professions that we have in society in general. Druidry represents a particular way of going about growing and growing in those practices and learning about those practices. And so there's a real necessity, really, within Druidry to be called to service. And that's apparently, I mean, I haven't started it yet, but that's apparently is a very big part of the Druid grade, is kind of being called to kind of offer service, not just within the Druid community, although that's one area in which people can do that, but within wider society. And I was thinking about this the other day, because I'm always, perhaps now would be a good time we can start talking about what the future might hold. And one of the things I was thinking about, one of the things I would love to kind of foster and develop more within Druidry is an exploration of that idea of perhaps of groves or even potentially camps as a site of service, as a place in which people can serve a wider network of relations, including non-humans. And what I then thought about was, and I was talking about this with a colleague who's also in the order, so an academic colleague, and we were talking about this, and I said, and I started thinking, and I thought, the way I would define a grove is it's a place of life-affirming relationships. And it's important that firstly, that it's a place and not a space. There's some really interesting anthropology all about the difference between place and space, and how space is basically almost passive, and you've kind of cleared everything out to make space for whatever it is that you're doing. You just plonk that on top. Whereas, a grove isn't like that. A grove, an essential important part of a grove is you go out and find a grove. You identify a specific collection of trees or a specific area of land that you're to, and then engage with the spirits that are already there. And this is reflected in Druidic liturgy, because one of the big differences between is that rather than between Druidry and, say, Western esotericism, is that instead of saying, instead of summoning in spirits into your circle, you acknowledge spirits that are already there. So you acknowledge the presence of, and what we were encouraged to. So there's a particular set liturgy. So you acknowledge the hawk of dawn in the east, the stag and the heat of the chase in the south, the salmon of wisdom in the west, and the bear and the great starry heavens in the north. But we're encouraged to identify with whatever's in those respective directions. So if you're standing in the middle of a field and to your east is an enormous mountain, right, and a big earthy thing or a big lake, calling to a hawk of dawn wouldn't necessarily make sense. You would call to and if, people will often do this. They'll often specifically alter the liturgy in order to situate themselves. And I would recommend this to everybody who's listening who don't do this, who stick to the liturgy. Many conversations I've had with Philip and Steph, and they've been like, use the space you're in, use the place you're in, more importantly. You're not clearing out, you're not plonking down Druidry on top of what that place is. You're using Druidry as a way to kind of build a relationship with that place. And the second thing is that it's a place of, not for. Because obviously life-affirming relationships can exist and should exist everywhere. They shouldn't just be confined to what goes on in your grove. You should be thinking about how you can extend life-affirming relationships in every aspect of your life, and to extend the roots of the grove, in a sense. And the other thing is about the notion of life-affirming, because I was thinking about this, and I was like, there is a bit of a temptation, I think, particularly within Druidry, that I feel is kind of perhaps less of a temptation within witchcraft, which is to get very new agey and very kind of like love and lighty, and become very super positive, and never to acknowledge death and dying and decay and those aspects. That's a temptation that I think comes from the kind of, because I think Druidry is quite a solar oriented path rather than a lunar oriented path. And I feel that solar orientation kind of triggers lots of positive associations with people. But I feel that if you
true, like I've heard that said before, and I find it so naff. When people like I'm like, what do you mean? Like,
what do I mean?
Okay, tell me what corresponded. Like, this is not to you, but like I've heard it said. Like, I think I read. I don't know anything about Philip Carr-Gomm. I'm sure that he is wise beyond belief, and I think he did write an article once, or an essay about like comparing maybe Wicca and Druidry as being solar and lunar, and I just thought, why? What does that mean? What are you talking about?
I will tell you why. So that actually came out of a debate between Philip and Ronald about the nature of Druidry and witchcraft, respective, and Wicca specifically. And that debate was taking place in a context where there was essentially, I was going to say turf war, but we've talked about why war is not necessarily the right framing to talk about it. But there was basically a there was kind of critiques emerging from within OBOD that was emerging at the time of Wicca, and there were critiques emerging within Wicca of Druidry, because they were both kind of operating in a similar space, and I keep talking to space, in a similar element of English society and English culture, and so
they were competing with each other.
Essentially, that was kind of. It was kind of like watching, you know, two wolves that have just kind of come into a clearing from either side and are kind of like sizing each other up. So that was kind of what was going on, and then they had this big debate, and then it was kind of that, and with kind of and that kind of facilitated a bit more of a kind of there was a kind of they came to a common understanding about where the differences lie and where the similarities lie, and I think that was one of the ways in which they attempted to kind of articulate that difference. So that's where that comes from, and quite obviously, you know, that, you know, to say that druids aren't interested in the moon, or that witches are. I mean, I feel very lunarly aligned, if that's a phraseology you can adopt. Like, I feel very drawn to the moon, and like, but one of the things that really got me interested in paganism, this is such a weird divergent like trend of thought, and a bit embarrassing, but I'll talk about it. One of the things that really got me like inclined to seek out paganism in an active way was actually playing World of Warcraft and all the rhetoric. I'm not kidding. All the way that the night elves talked about their moon goddess, and I just thought, oh, a moon goddess, that sounds so wonderful. Oh, I love that. That sounds amazing. And I kind of started doing all this googling about, you know, goddesses, and then that kind of led me into like discovering. And then I think I found out about the Sweet books. Oh, it wasn't World of Warcraft. That's right. It was Warcraft 3, so it was before World of Warcraft. So I must have been. God, I don't know how old I was when that came out, but I loved it. I was absolutely addicted. I was playing as night elf the whole time. But basically, a lot of the night elf theology is actually based on neo-pagan stuff. Like, you've got druids, and you've got priestesses of the moon. You've got like a lot of like the priestesses have kind of owls with them all the time. So there's this kind of Minerva symbolism kind of going on, and there's this kind of Artemis quality because they're huntresses in the woods. There's a lot of pagan symbolism that's kind of ended up within at least Warcraft 3's incarnation of night elves, and that sent me off on my interest. So like, I love that. I wouldn't say I'm solar, but I think nonetheless, where was I? Oh yeah, the point about so end of sidebar. The point is that I do feel that you do occasionally meet some people, normally people who are quite new to Druidry, who see it as kind of like, as very kind of like love, and like I say, as kind of wholly positive and no interest or engagement with death and dying, and which is completely bunk, you know, like that neglects a whole half of the year. And it neglects an incredibly important part of the human cycle. And anyone if you spend any time in the order, or you spend any time reading Druidic texts, you realise that that's absolutely not true. And that death is as important and is as valued as life, as in witchcraft and Wicca. So you've got this kind of value, you've got that kind of process there. But the reason why I say life affirming is that's viewing kind of life with a capital L. So life as a continuing process, the turning of the wheel, not life as opposed to death. It's kind of, you know, yeah. So that's how I kind of, what I see a grove as. And I've been thinking a little bit about what I would like to see for the future is trying to kind of figure out almost a way of groving. Oh God, coined a neologism there, groving, way of creating a grove, a way of groving that is not just that is very rooted in, because I've seen people doing this up and down the country, like in with their own groves and independently, and I feel like it's not something that's talked about enough because it's so important, and that is connecting your druidic activities and the things you do as a druid with local organizations, local conservation practices, local land management practices, the way food, you know, biodiversity, water, clean air are circulated and restored within your community, and finding a way of embedding your druidic practice as a group with that and supporting that with your druidic practice. And I feel that finding out, like, because I think a lot of people talk about it is it's a little bit like it's kind of a nice to have rather than the very basis of how you build a grove. And I feel like that's just how we talk. That's just how people tend to talk about it. But I feel if you actually said it to people and asked people, they would say, "Oh no, absolutely." You know, finding a way of conserving the landscape that we live within and we work ritually within is absolutely crucial. But I feel like I'd like to see that explored more and expanded upon and developed for the future. And that would be where I'd like to take Druidic understandings of community, make it more political, make it more as much an an economic thing as it is a kind of a spiritual and a moral thing. How about you? How would you like to see the communities in which you are part develop in the future?
I guess I have two very different answers for my traditions. For Wildwood, just the continuation of the love of our law, of the love of our spirits, of connecting with them, of continuously developing, deepening excellence in our sorceress and mystic and ecstatic craft, like being witches, being spirit workers. One of my favorite things, one of the things I'm most passionate about, is to help to inspire, mentor, guide, and facilitate people to become their best sorceress selves, their best transgressive selves, their best witchy selves. It's one of the things I love the most, and I've been doing with great gusto and passion for 10 years publicly, or publicly availably in a way, you know. In terms of reclaiming has a different ethos. Reclaiming has well, not a different, it's like it dovetails. But the ethos of reclaiming is so life affirming in the way you're talking about. I mean, you know, we are very druidic, like you know, but we are also very witchy. So, you know, our practices our ritual is about communing with community in every fucking way. Like, it's almost, for me, it's almost like pointless to have a reclaiming ritual alone. Like, I just don't do that alone. I can do Wildwood ritual alone all the time, like me being the only human there. But in terms of reclaiming ritual, I don't do that alone. It's something I do with groups of people. Like when we do the core classes, when we go through the core classes, you don't do it in a one-to-one apprenticeship like you might do in Wildwood or in another witchcraft tradition. You do it with a group. It is set up to be in group containers, endlessly so. And we are committed to the world changing, world renewing act of magic, and we are committed to saying no to the things that ought to be said no to, and we are committed to saying yes to the things that connect us to capital L life. You know, and we do it. We as a culture, as a series of cultures, as a collective, we do it in the name of what we often call the goddess, which is just our poetry of you know, I think I said this to you before, but referring to the great cycles of birth, growth, death, decay, and regeneration. That's what we name it, the goddess. So, you know, that's not a deity. That's the ground of being. That's you know, Starhawk has used the word immanence. It's immanence, you know. So, that's what we're defending and safeguarding in a very tribal way, like in this like deeply tribal way, connected to, when I say that, I mean embedded in more than human, because I believe that that's what tribal means. Like a lot of kind of new agey people have kind of co-opted or appropriated that term to refer to some like trustafarian wankdom, where you get together and you wear Native American headdresses and put feathers in your hair and play didgeridoos and hit Tibetan singing bowls and talk about love and light and how isn't it amazing, and that we're the rainbow people and we're gonna ascend to the seventh dimension. I lived in Ubud.
What? Well, yeah.
Although Byron Bay is the same. Look, like, you know, I mean tribe in a very, you know, pagan way, a heathen way, and you know, we are that way. That's kind of those are our ethos. I mean, you just have to look up the principles of unity to see that is the case. And and look, Reclaiming is a marvelously set up organization. Like, you know, we have a witch camp council. We have wheels and hubs and cells and guilds, and we have our fucking lion's share of conflict, like every fucking human organization does. And we suck, and we're good, and we're great, and we are triumphant, and we suck, and we're good, and we're great. But basically, I'm not particularly concerned about the longevity or endurance of any of the traditions that I have touched. You know, I have had the great deep pleasure of being trained in and initiated in a quite private sorceress order of traditional craft, and I have no concern about them enduring and flourishing into the future either. Like, witchcraft will always live. Which, if there was a huge near extinction of humans, I would not be concerned, because witchcraft is savage. Witchcraft is a wild weed. Witchcraft will always live as long as there are humans dreaming of our origins.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something we talked about a tremendous amount, like, but one of the things that Christine Black, a legal theorist, colleague of mine, who, when I went down to Australia, I met, she said, you know, that you've got to stop, like, talking about Druidry as if it's just what you guys are doing, because it's in the land as well. And I think that applies really to, and that's exactly what, because it is, you know, I mean, we're the creatures that and beings who we engage with through our kind of animist practice and in the land itself, they've not stopped doing what they're doing.
Absolutely.
You know, they've never stopped. They're carrying on doing what they're doing. I mean, you know, and even if the planet is radically altered through the processes of climate change, that won't change everything. Like, the mountains and the ocean and the kind of oceans have got their own sort of cycles that they're going on with. And, you know, even if human beings are a geological event, we are a geological event. We're not the only geological event. Like, there, like, you know, these mysteries that we are interested and involved in stretch to the stars and back. Like, you're not going to. That's a lovely note on which to end, I think.
Yeah, and I'd love to share a piece of kind of like poetic prose that I channeled today, actually, that is kind of about this.
Oh,
if I may. So I wrote this today for some of the aspirants or students that I work with or or lovingly like witness in the wild wood, and I wrote this about our lineage. So it was kind of, I didn't write it kind of conscientiously. I did my whole, like, kind of, you know, what you would say Arwen. I just let the Arwen do it. So, you inquire of our lineage. Look to the woods and you will see. It is the altar stone I am named for. It is the ring of stones that wreath the lady's mantle. It is the very real flesh and breath of the gods most will not see. It is the knife I have handed to you. It is the mirror of the pool, of the well, of the sea, of the moon, of the mist, of the dead, of the bones, of the stars, of the needles, of the iron, of the darkness, of the beginning of the light, of the devouring of the breath that ends and rends the wasteland to once more become the mad poetry of life. If by me you come to the crossroads, then you are in my company. And if one seeks to test you, simply say, I am a daughter of Ara. I am in her image. Blessed are the daring, for we shall inherit the power. And blessed are the powerful who are wed to the law of justice. And that's what I wrote today.
I was kind of reminds me in tone, you know, like, because I read there's that wonderful bit of let me see. There's that wonderful bit of Puck of Pook's Hill that I quoted in an article I've just written that I really loved, even though it's kind of, he's the way what's his name? My mind's going blank. you know, even though Rudyard Kipling, when he talks about it, he's saying that Puck is saying that, you know, all the magical people of England have already gone, which is something I don't agree with. Nonetheless, I think it's a beautiful description, which is, he refers to them as the people of the hills. And he says, you know, I saw them come into old England and I saw them go. Giants, trolls, kelpies, brownies, goblins, imps, wood, tree, mound and water spirits, heath people, hill watchers, treasure guards, good people, little people, pishogues, leprechauns, night riders, pixies, nixies, gnomes and the rest. And whenever I think of that, like, you know, if you set the kind of idea that this kind of extinction, this kind of very Victorian extinction narrative aside, I always listen to that and I think, yes, that's my community. Definitely.
Yes, queen. That's my community. Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
Wonderful. Oh, well, it was a pleasure as always.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was lovely.
Let us go be the mad poetry of life.
Indeed. So I guess this is it. Bye, everyone, and thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.